Every nation on Earth is drowning in debt, over $315 trillion and climbing. But here's the question almost no one asks. If every country owes money, then who exactly is everyone borrowing from? Because the answer isn't China, it isn't Wall Street, it isn't even the IMF. The truth is far stranger. Take the United States, the biggest borrower on Earth. Here's the twist. Most of America's debt is money the nation owes to itself, a financial loop hidden in plain sight. And it doesn't stop there, because every dollar, euro, and yen exists only because someone, somewhere, owes a debt. There's no such thing as money without an IOU behind it. So how did the world end up in a system where debt fuels everything? Wars, markets, nations, and your daily life. And what happens when confidence in that system finally cracks? Welcome to the Economic Archive, where money, power, and history meet in ways that reshape how we see the world. Because debt is not just a number on a government ledger. It is the skeleton holding up modern society. Every war fought, every crisis survived, every financial boom and every devastating bust, all of them rest on a foundation of promises and IOUs that connect nations together in ways few truly understand. And when you follow these threads far enough, something surprising emerges. The world isn't borrowing from some mysterious outside force, it is borrowing from itself. But that doesn't mean every nation or every person carries the same weight. Some benefit enormously from this system, others barely stay afloat. Here's the part most politicians won't tell you. To understand how humanity ended up in a world built on more than $315 trillion of total debt, nearly 3 times the size of the global economy, we need to step backwards, not to Wall Street skyscrapers, not to the trading floors of Tokyo or London, but to a time when nations fought for survival, and financial innovation was born out of desperation. The birth of national debt. Long before modern banking apps, credit cards, or digital currencies existed, governments paid for their ambitions with gold and silver. If a king ran out of precious metal, the war stopped, expansion halted, and power quickly faded. But in the late 1600s, England faced a crisis. Locked in a brutal conflict with France, the country's gold supply was running dangerously low. Without money, the war was lost. The crown needed a new way to raise funds, a way that didn't rely on treasure chests filled with coins. So the monarchy turned to a different kind of resource: wealthy merchants. In exchange for dependable interest payments, guaranteed by future taxes, merchants agreed to finance the government. To organize this new financial structure, England created the Bank of England, a decision that permanently changed global economics. For the first time, a government could spend money that it didn't already have in its possession, and lenders received something revolutionary in return: a government promise backed by the power to tax millions, a promise so valuable it could be traded, sold, or passed on. The government bond was born. This new tool spread quickly across Europe. France adopted the model, the Netherlands perfected it, and the young United States relied on it heavily while fighting for independence and expanding westward. Debt had transformed from a weakness into a strength, from a burden into a symbol of trust. In ancient times, empires marched across continents to seize gold, land, or resources. But with the rise of sovereign debt, a new kind of empire emerged, one that could earn returns without conquest. Why steal gold when you could earn interest instead? The battlefield shifted from blood and soil to numbers and contracts. Armies still fought, but power increasingly came from financial credibility, not from treasure vaults. Debt becomes the world's most traded product. Fast forward to the modern age, and debt has become the planet's most traded commodity. Global borrowing grows by nearly $1 trillion every 100 days. Every government issues bonds. Every bank holds them. Every insurance company, pension fund, corporation, and investor is woven into this system. Whether people know it or not, they are part of the cycle. Through taxes, savings accounts, retirement plans, mortgages, and investments, everyone becomes both a debtor and a creditor. But even with all these connections, one question sits at the center of it all: who is on the other side of the deal? To answer that, we start with the biggest issuer of debt on the planet, the United States. Of America's enormous debt, about half is held by public investors. But here is a twist many people never realize. 2 out of every 3 U.S. bondholders are American. Banks, mutual funds, insurance companies, pension funds, they all treat government bonds as the safest place to store money. Even the Federal Reserve buys these bonds to help guide the economy. Foreign governments hold the remaining portion, roughly $9 trillion. Japan has the largest share, followed by China, then the United Kingdom and several European financial centers. But despite political debates, China's share is small, only about 2% of the entire U.S. debt. Most of America's debt is money the nation owes to itself. The government issues bonds. Financial institutions buy them. The central bank may purchase them as well, creating new dollars in the process. Taxpayers pay interest. That interest flows back into American retirement funds and investment accounts. It is a self-contained financial loop, and the U.S. is not alone. This pattern repeats around the world. Japan invests heavily in American bonds. The U.S. supports Europe through the IMF. Europe lends to developing nations. Developing nations then reinvest their currency reserves into Western debt markets. Debt is not a straight line. It is a circle, a complex system of promises exchanged between nations, institutions, and investors. If you imagine a poker table where every player has borrowed chips from someone else, you begin to understand the scale of this interconnected system. Nobody actually owns the chips they're using. They simply trust the game will continue. The only rule that keeps the system stable is that no one gets up and walks away. The invisible empire, global markets, but there is another layer, a layer even more powerful than governments. The markets, this includes hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, central banks, and massive investment institutions managing trillions of dollars. These players decide which nations can borrow cheaply, which must pay higher interest, which economies appear stable, which governments may fall under pressure. If markets lose confidence in a nation, its currency can collapse in days. Political leaders can be forced out. An entire economy can be reshaped by outside pressure. In democratic societies, citizens vote for leaders. But in the financial world, markets decide who survives. At the very top of this global hierarchy are central banks, the high priests of the monetary order. Central banks do not simply move money around. They create it. Whenever the Federal Reserve or European Central Bank purchases government bonds, they inject new currency into the economy. One person's debt becomes another person's asset, and the cycle strengthens. This reveals a truth most people never consider. Every dollar, euro, and yen is backed by debt. There is no such thing as money without an IOU behind it. The entire financial system rests on confidence, the belief that debts will be serviced, interest will be paid, and promises will be honored. Paying off debt would cause collapse, but history shows us confidence is fragile. When confidence breaks, economies rarely collapse because they run out of numbers. They collapse because they run out of belief. When investors lose trust, even the strongest economies can suddenly look fragile. Greece learned this the hard way in 2010. As doubts spread about the government's ability to repay its obligations, borrowing costs exploded. Interest rates soared, turning routine debt payments into an impossible burden. International lenders stepped in, but their rescue came with strict demands. Taxes rose, public wages fell, retirement ages increased, entire public services shrank or disappeared. For many Greek citizens, the financial crisis didn't feel like a temporary downturn. It felt like a lost decade. Argentina endured a similar fate, but on an even larger scale. Years of economic mismanagement led to repeated defaults. Each default scarred the national economy, wiping out savings, shrinking salaries, and leaving generations skeptical of any institution that promised stability. And then there is Sri Lanka. When the nation ran out of foreign currency, it could no longer import fuel or essential goods. Long lines formed at gas stations. Electricity cut out for hours. Citizens flooded the streets in frustration. The government fell not because of war, but because of debt. In each of these crises, one thing suddenly became clear. Creditors, who normally remain invisible, scattered across the world, became unmistakably present. International institutions, global rating agencies, distant investment funds, bondholders with enormous influence, yet no democratic accountability. These actors don't appear when everything is calm. They appear when everything goes wrong. But here is the most surprising part. Even after a crisis devastates a nation, the global system insists on continuing. Default is not the end. It is simply a reset. Old debts are renegotiated. New loans are issued. Fresh promises replace broken ones. The machine never stops. Because sovereign debt was never designed with repayment in mind. It was designed to roll forward forever. The truth: governments do not plan to pay off debt. When individuals borrow money, they carry the expectation of one day paying it back. But governments operate differently, almost opposite to this idea. Countries refinance their debt continuously. They pay off old bonds by issuing new ones. They extend maturities, adjust interest rates, and swap their obligations across decades. Economists politely call this a refinancing strategy, but the reality is closer to a subscription model. As long as investors trust the government, the cycle of borrowing and rolling over continues without interruption. The true product in this system is interest. Interest payments keep the economy's institutions running. Interest feeds pension funds. Interest stabilizes insurance companies. Interest supports banks and financial markets. The global economy relies on this constant flow, the way a living body relies on a heartbeat. Japan is the clearest example. Its debt exceeds 250% of GDP, the highest ratio in the developed world. But its borrowing costs remain near zero. Why? Because investors believe Japan will always be able to refinance. They believe the government will keep rolling its debts forward indefinitely. This belief, not gold, not resources, not production, is what keeps the system alive. To global investors, government debt is not a danger. It is a treasure. Treasuries and sovereign bonds serve as safe assets for retirement funds, collateral that banks use to borrow and lend, stable reserves for central banks, anchors for financial markets. If the United States or Japan suddenly paid off all their debt, it wouldn't spark celebration. It would trigger chaos. The money supply would shrink rapidly. Banks would lose the safest collateral they depend on. Financial markets would collapse into deflation. The global economy would seize like an engine losing all oil at once. As strange as it sounds, paying off national debt would destroy the world economy. So governments continue the rhythm, not recklessly but predictably, consistently. Debt becomes the pulse of capitalism itself. Politicians may promise to reduce the debt or balance the budget, but these are illusions meant to comfort voters. Behind the scenes, the real goal is simple: keep the system stable enough for confidence to survive. Because if confidence collapses, the numbers collapse with it. Who really pays? To calm public concern, policymakers often say, "We owe the debt to ourselves." This statement contains some truth, but not the truth that matters. Yes, much of a nation's debt is held domestically, but that doesn't mean everyone shares the costs equally. Interest payments flow upward. From workers' gives to banks, from taxpayers' gives to investment funds, from households' gives to wealthy asset holders, from the general public gives to elite institutions. Debt is not just a system between nations, it is a system between classes. Those who own debt through bonds, funds, and investments receive steady streams of income. Those who pay into the system through taxes and inflation shoulder the weight. Global inequality rises not only because of wages and wealth differences, but because of who owns the IOUs. Most people do not realize they participate in this system at all. They simply pay taxes, save for retirement, make mortgage payments, and assume the system works roughly in their favor. But in reality, the global financial structure channels enormous wealth from the many to the few, from ordinary citizens to the institutions that hold debt. Debt has become not only a financial tool, but a method for redistributing wealth upward. Household debt, national debt, global debt, different levels, same mechanism. Those who lend prosper, those who repay struggle. So, who is the creditor? With all of this in mind, we finally return to the central question. If every country is in debt, who is the global creditor? The answer is far more complex than naming a single country or institution. It is not China, despite common belief. It is not Wall Street, though its influence is vast. It is not even the IMF, though it shapes the rules of global finance. Instead, the creditor is everyone and no one. It is the entire global system: governments, banks, markets, funds, institutions, and citizens, all holding each other's promises. The world owes money to itself, but some parts of the world hold far more of the IOUs than others. Debt has evolved beyond a mere burden. It has become a kind of money, a form of value so essential that modern economies cannot function without it. The lines between lender and borrower have blurred so much that they barely exist. Nations borrow from markets. Markets borrow from central banks. Central banks create money by buying debt. Citizens rely on that money to live. Governments depend on citizens to pay taxes. Taxes service the debt. Debt funds the system. The system fuels the markets. The markets decide the fate of nations. It is a closed loop, elegant, powerful, and dangerously fragile. The final warning: debt once meant chains, lost land, or imprisonment. Today it means balance, a fragile equilibrium of promises and expectations. But balance can shift, promises can break, confidence can fall. If belief in repayment fades, if refinancing stops, if markets lose trust, if governments run out of room to maneuver, the illusion ends, and the world remembers the truth. Debt is a promise that cannot be kept forever, only carried forward long enough to prevent collapse. The global economy survives not because it is stable, but because enough people believe it will remain stable. In the end, the real foundation of the modern world is not gold, not productivity, not resources, and not technology. It is trust. If this changed the way you see the modern financial system, so like, share, and subscribe it. History doesn't just repeat, it reveals what we failed to notice the first time. And the answers are always there for those who know where to look. Would paying off the debt fix inequality or break everything? Tell me below.